Okay, we've got a really full house, and in deference to everyone's schedules, I want to get us started because this is a short session. Again, I'm Nancy Cellini. I'll be your moderator, and I am just wanting to remind you all that this is 45 minutes in length. We will end promptly at 4:45 today. This is a webinar, so we're in a controlled environment, so we don't get Zoom bombed, and also so that mics aren't left open and that can be distracting. I'm really happy though that towards the end of this, Tony, who's in the background, is going to be unmuting your mics if you want to ask a question. So if you want to ask a question as we go, raise your hand. It's an icon at the bottom of your screen. Or if you don't really want to talk, you're welcome to submit a question in the chat. And then we'll be reading those questions when we go to Q&A. I want to thank Tony for his help in the background to run things. You may hear me calling upon him. And I'm deeply grateful today to John Molson for being here. And to those of you who helped spread the word, including John Soliter, Pauline, and Mark Kalish, and my other dear friends and colleagues who are all sharing right now the reality of what it's like to be over 50 something, but still pursuing those physical activities we love to do, whether it's biking, hiking, running, walking, martial arts, or yoga. But there's something that comes with being a little mature in our days, and that is experiencing pain, discomfort, and sometimes injury from doing these things. If you want to keep doing them and doing them for a long time yet, you're in the right place. Because little did I know that something I'd been doing for a number of years would literally save me and help me get back to the things I love. And more on that in the explanation of the title of this session today, You'll Never Be the Same Again. You'll come to see that that has two meanings, and one may even have a little something to do with ageism. You see, we all tend to look at older people a little bit differently, but we really shouldn't be, because one thing the cohort of baby boomers has demonstrated is that we can stay active, we can stay strong, and we can stay engaged way past the years that others thought maybe that it was possible. For some older athletes, you may want to just improve your speed in an upcoming race, or some of you may just want to be able to play more frequently with your grandkids. Let me tell you about how important this discussion is today, because what we're talking about is a supplement that's been well studied for decades. And one of the studies that was done demonstrated how people considered older can still gain muscle strength. And in this key study, they found that muscle strength was gained to the tune of 10%. Now, that may not sound a lot if you're in the financial market, but in health and in strength, that's huge. Actually, the study group that was given the very supplement we're going to be talking about today gained that extra 10% in muscle. And what does that mean? Well, it translates to a hike with your favorite buddies, more time on your yoga mat, or maybe picking your grandchild up and swinging them so you hear their giggles. And let's not downplay the importance of just being able to have functional strength. Being able to sit in a chair and rise up on your own is huge. We need to maintain our strength and our muscles to be able to do that. And you should probably know, and maybe you've heard, that's one of the #1 causes of loss of quality of life, or not being able to climb stairs. As a public health professional, we look closely at these factors as they yield a loss of quality of life. Years ago, I even remember my father's mother, who had diabetes and was quite heavy, being told to really sit in a corner. And basically she did. And I think you know what happened after that. But we're staying active. We keep moving. Again, this baby boomer generation, and by the way, most of us will be 65 by the year 2030 who are in that cohort, but we are active. Out of the 55 million practitioners of yoga today, there's 14 million who are over the age of 50. That's a substantial number. Hiking, which I know many of you are very active in, comprises over 49 million people nationwide. And approximately 20% of them, 16% of them, I'm sorry, in 2020, were over the age of 50. Biking, running, walking have all increased in older adults as a result of the pandemic too, I might add. So all of that wasn't bad. But how do you stay strong and healthy and immune ready as you age? When we lose 10 pounds of lean muscle mass for every decade of adult life after age 40, you can begin to see the cascade of events that unfortunately can happen if we rest too much and we become inactive. And our muscles aren't the only thing that decline. One of the substances that is a natural production within our own body also declines over age. As we age, the way that we can maintain physical health and strength is not only by eating well and by exercising, but making sure that we're taking in the right vitamins and antioxidants. And we're going to be focusing on one today. Tony, if you would go to the next slide, please. This is our agenda. After we cover each point and a personal story, I'm going to be turning it over to John Molson today, who's going to do a lot of the talking, and I'm going to guide him with some questions that I know people are wanting to ask, and then we'll take your questions after that. So Tony, if you could go to the next slide, please. So who are we? What qualifies us to be talking to you about this? Well, I'm a lifelong athlete. I'm also known as Oba to my grandchildren. I have 4. That's short for Oba-san, Japanese, explains my martial arts background. I am a black belt. I'm the founder of Just Breathe Yoga, clinical yoga therapy. I have an undergraduate in environmental science, computer science, and a doctorate of public health, which means I care really deeply about not just some people, but about everyone. And one of my quests that I'm on in the year 2021, and you'll learn more about that shortly, is to make sure that everybody knows what a real game changer I was lucky enough to have on board in a time when I really needed it. And I'm joined today by someone who is not only a good friend, but a very wonderful colleague. And I'm getting to do these health talks with him very frequently these days because people like all of you who tuned in today, they want to listen and they want to learn about something your doctor probably won't tell you about. So I'm joined today by John Molson. You can see some of his CV points there. But John, why don't you say a welcome to our audience and tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you very much. I never knew you were a black belt is that karate?
Yes, yes.
I studied Shotokan. I'm only a brown belt, so what can I say? Anyways, it's great to be here. I approach all of this with great humility because I had the opportunity to work with people that changed scientific literature in terms of their work, and I can characterize much of my early athletic career as trial and error. So the fact that I made almost every mistake in the book when I was competing as a young athlete and still managed to have some success, really when I started to work with Dr. Bunos, Dr. Droog, and the people at Oracle, it really highlighted, and I absorbed the information I was getting and actually used all that information to help train my son and daughter. So I'm still an athlete. I train today about 6 hours. I love sports. I love helping people. And I enjoy passing on what I learned from Dr. Bunos and Dr. Droog and the people that I worked with over the generations.
Excellent. And John's leaving out a whole bunch of details, but to tell you that he had a very primary role in the research and the supplement we're going to be talking today, and has a son who's an NFL Green Bay player who was raised on this stuff. I could tell you lots of other interesting details about John, but I'll let him tell you some of those as we get to the questions and the questions that I have for him momentarily. So thanks again, John, for being here. These are fun to do with you. And again, the feedback I've gotten from colleagues and friends friends in the medical field have been around how valuable these sessions are with you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Go to the next slide. I just want to do a little level setting. I want to tell you about this antioxidant, and I want to reassure you all that we're not talking about some voodoo science here. We're not talking about some supplement that was whipped up in somebody's laboratory just a few weeks ago. We're talking today about a natural antioxidant that's found in plants and animals and bacteria. This amazing antioxidant that, again, unless you go to someone who's very alternative, very integrative, maybe a functional medicine professional, they won't talk to you about your cellular level health. And I want to take this down to like tiny, tiny little elements. Think of every single cell in your body needing to be healthy, needing to turn over when they need to turn over. Our cells today are bombarded with what's called ROS, reactive oxygen species. Perhaps you've heard about this in another way as someone saying free radicals. We also have a lot of heavy metals in our environment that we're exposed to. So the master antioxidant, as far as we're concerned, because that's what it is a tripeptide. Tripeptide, tri means three, and it's a peptide. These are amino acids. I hope to be taking some of you back to ninth grade basic science, but in case you've forgotten, glutamate, cysteine, and glycine are amino acids. Amino acids build other entities and other reactions in the body. So they're super important, along with vitamin A and vitamin C. And we heard a lot about vitamin D supplies during this pandemic. All of them are important, but there is one that's considered the master antioxidant. And that's what John and I are going to zero in on today. If we go to the next slide, please. Let me just lay out the story for you. The reason why this is so critical to our health and as we age is because we do have the natural ability to fight off viruses. We can fight off infections, immobilize toxins, and we can recover really well. And I'll tell you, when I was in my 30s and 40s in the dojo, recovering after a 4 or 5 hour session of kumite, which is fighting, I did pretty well the next day. I probably couldn't do that today. It's a little scary to think about, but it's important that we still have the reserves to be able to recover from exercise. I have to often remind older athletes who tell me, oh gosh, I'm so sore. I thought I was beyond this. Exercise itself can produce stress and can produce its own share of free radicals. So having to have this balance all the time between what we do and what we're exposed to is critical. And what we're exposed to, my heavens. John and I just did a talk recently on pollutants in the environment and what we call personal pollution or body pollution. We're exposed to toxins in basically everything. And that's another talk altogether. If some of you are interested in that, I'm sure we'll be running that again in the future, John, because this antioxidant helps us to fight against the pollutants and toxins that are everywhere, even in the cord blood of newborn babies. Some over 213 different toxic substances have been found in a recent study in fetal blood. So if you don't believe how polluted a world we're living in, look at that research. It's daunting. Our livers produce this substance, but our bodies have to keep pace with all of this. Our natural ability to produce the enzyme that recycles these antioxidants that help us do all this can be diminished. They can be diminished from age. As a matter of fact, they are diminished with age. Let me speak factually to you. And there are some genetic factors that limit people's ability to turn over these antioxidants. And as we age, one of the most critical antioxidants we have gets depleted. So that's the picture. That's the story that we're talking about. And if I've gotten your attention, that's a good thing. So Tony, if we can go to the next slide quickly. What are we talking about? We're talking about glutathione. There is the actual definition on the right side of this slide, in that it's a crystalline water-soluble peptide. I already kind of laid that out. It's an antioxidant. And we're talking today about a product that's a specially formulated whey protein isolate that assists the body in maintaining these optimal concentrations of glutathione. Because what happens is there's a steep drop off as we're exposed to all of those things that we've been talking about, including strenuous exercise. So don't think that if you're exercising all the time, you're just fine. As you're older, we still need to be mindful of this natural supply we have on board. Next slide. Just real quickly, let me tell you exactly how important this substance is to me. July of last year, and it's a quick but a very personal story, I was in a really horrific cycling accident. One of my key loves has been cycling for decades. I was struck from behind at a high rate of speed, thrown off of my bicycle into the middle of a road, broke 3 major joints all on the right-hand side of my body: my shoulder, my elbow, and my femur just below the hip joint. You could say I was a mess. And that comment, "you will never be the same again," actually came from one of the ER doctors who came in with my results of the CAT scan and everything else that they had run on me and said, "You know, these injuries can be fatal. You're lucky to be here, and you will never be the same again." And I remember in that moment feeling like, where is that coming from? Well, that surgeon became one of mine. He's a good guy, and he was right. I have never been the same again. But there was one thing that I did that was exceptional, and I really believed helped me to get back stronger, more determined than ever. And yes, I'm still doing all the things I love to do because I had been taking Immunical for many, many years. I will tell you that for me was a game changer. And just to put it in perspective, you don't just walk away from injuries like mine, and not at my age, which was mentioned many, many times to me. So when my trauma surgeon who did my shoulder said to me, "I can't believe this. You're only 4.5 months into your healing, but you're at that of a 2-year healing period. What else do you do?" He knew I was a lifelong athlete. The moment I mentioned glutathione and Immunical, he was one of only a handful of doctors who actually remembered this mechanism of action of glutathione on the body. And he said, "Good for you. You probably would have never healed this way if it hadn't been for taking that product." And yes, being an athlete, yes, eating well, yes, having a lot of loving people around me, all those things go into health. But that's my story. And I've talked about this at length with John Molson, who's also a very avid cyclist. And I've asked him, and I'm going to ask you again, John, start us off. Tony, next slide. Why probably did I do better than if I hadn't been taking Immunical? And welcome. Talk to us. Tell us about Immunical.
Well, the story starts in the late 70s in the academic environment of McGill University, where Dr. Bunos, who's a career investigator with the Canadian Medical Research Council, received a package, and the people from Europe said, "See if you can find something with this product." And he had a colleague who was one of the top clinical immunologists in Canada working with him, who said, "I have a mouse model." And so they started working with this mouse model, and they found that lo and behold, when these mice were consuming this product and then challenged, they developed an immune response over and above what you would typically see in other forms of protein. And they couldn't figure out why this was occurring. And a colleague next door, who's now head of the translational research department at McGill, said, you should look at glutathione. And lo and behold, that was probably the mechanism. They went on to do further works with regard to elucidating the mechanism with immune function. They studied models in cancer and got a patent for an anti-cancer effect, and brought it to a certain point, 10, 15 years later, where they commercialized it, and we formed a partnership. And I got the opportunity to work with Dr. Bunos and the immunologist, Dr. Kongshaven, to commercialize this. And what was interesting is, up until that point, there was no real kind of commercial goals. So the whole focus of this was what's called in category 1 diseases. So you're talking about, what's called the model of immune deficiency, the AIDS. So they did studies in AIDS patients, pediatric AIDS patients, cancer patients. But because of the regulatory environment, it was very hard to commercialize that back then because, we couldn't talk about that. And I was at the tail end of my athletic career. And when I was sitting with Dr. Bunos on planes, trains, and automobiles, we talked about everything under the sun, including, my experience as an athlete when I talked about fatigue, wellness. And so he started to think about, how you define wellness, how you define fatigue vis-a-vis the athlete. What does it mean to improve quality of life? And so from that point on, we started to work in athletics, in performance, lung function, etc. And, over the last, let's say 24 years, we've published probably in the area of 30 papers. And many of those papers, we've looked at quality of life in cancer patients. We've looked at what's called prehabilitation, where you're actually, training a patient before they have surgery, using immunical exercise, etc. Well, all this to say that what we've seen, the central theme is that we can impact quality of life, and quality of life is not trivial. These are parameters that look at, blood parameters. They look at physical performance. So there's a very good reason and a number of reasons why you experience what you experience, because we've seen it both in the stage 4 lung cancer patient as well as the Olympic athlete.
So John, talk to us a little bit more about prehabilitation. That's a very interesting concept. I don't know that everyone in our audience today knows about that. And there's one thing that people who are over the ripe old age of 50-something do face, and that is surgery. So
Yeah.
talk to us about preparing for surgery as if it's a marathon.
So, I was thinking today, and I was going to bring up an example of some of the things that I see with regard to athletes, elderly athletes, when they're training for sports. I was thinking about my son, who's with, as you mentioned, the Green Bay Packers. And I'm thinking about the amount of hours he puts in to prepare his body to go out and kick for 1 hour. So think of pro athletes, how they prepare their bodies to go into preseason and then the season, the amount of time they prepare. And this physician, who is a good friend of mine, I actually sit on the board of this foundation now, because everything that's done through this prehabilitation initiative is all nonprofit. So we have to raise the money, because the situation in Canada is just as dire as it is in the US. He said to me, the first population were colorectal cancer patients. He said, that these people come to me. He said, typically they're elderly, they're not eating properly, and as a consequence, they've, lost weight. They've got a catabolic condition where they're losing muscle mass. Because they're losing weight and they have low energy, they're not eating properly, and also they're psychologically distressed. So he designed this intervention program where we give them access to a nutritionist who gives them a meal plan together with 20 grams of Immunical a day. They give them an exercise program as well as a psychological support. And it's fascinating because they do this 30 days prior to the surgery. And then they've charted, and they end up saving the hospital up to $2,000 per patient, because these patients, they recover quicker, they can start the chemo earlier, and there's less secondary infections, so they don't have to be readmitted. So, this whole principle of boosting resilience, boosting strength, applies just as importantly to an elderly colorectal cancer patient as it does to the Olympic athlete.
Yeah, and you've shared with me how Olympic athletes tend to fatigue out probably the week just before or during the Olympics. John, can you talk about that overtraining kind of result, and talk about how does Immunical actually help in that kind of circumstance? What is it doing? I'm asked that all the time.
Yeah. So we were very fortunate. 10 years ago, I received a phone call from a gentleman named Dr. Nathan Lewis, who was with the English Institute of Sport. And he was He's a nutritionist working with the British Olympic sailing program. And, sailors do very intense training. So he was interested in using Immunical as a supplement for these sailors. Subsequent to that time, he formed, together with a few other people, a company called Oracle. And Oracle at the time was working with athletes across 10 different disciplines, 500 athletes, and we're talking about World Cup sailing, we're talking about F1 racing, we're talking about the English Premier League, so the top athletes in the world. And essentially, the whole thesis behind Oracle in the beginning was how do you prevent what's called overreaching or overtraining? And they've developed through collaborations with IBM as well as hematologists, a whole set of biomarkers that measure and prevent overtraining, and they actually use AI together with IBM Watson to make sense of this. So in essence, what they've shown is that if your blood antioxidant capacity goes below certain thresholds, and that's probably varies for each athlete, that you increase your risk of injury and illness. So these things are used as tools for both the athlete as well as the coaches. And we're talking about NBA players, NFL players, the top athletes in the world. Because the whole idea is, with elite athletes, is you want to load them to a certain point to get them to perform at their best. But the question is, where's that inflection point where you're actually then causing them to go over the edge, and it's diminishing returns, and they increase the risk of illness and injury. And the big thing for pro athletes is, are you available? So Oracle plays a vital role, and Oracle uses Immunical as a tool to boost that antioxidant capacity to prevent them from going outside those ranges.
And what's the significance, John? I've been asked this a lot too, of the whey formula. Why is it special in Immunical? What's the significance there? What was that finding? You mentioned that Dr. Bonos discovered, but why is it important today as people are considering supplementation?
Well, it's interesting. Dr. Bonos explained to me mammalian milk. If you look at mammalian milk, animals born, let's say, in Africa, have a higher concentration of protein than human milk, because these animals, have to develop very quickly and get away from lions, whereas mammalian milk is much lower in protein. Human milk is much lower in protein because you're talking about a much longer development time, specifically for the brain. But the whey component of human milk is much higher than that of other mammalian species. So he says there's probably some evolutionary preference there. When the baby is born, human milk is 100% whey, and then when the baby attains 3 months old, it's 80% whey, 20% casein. So cow's milk is actually the reverse. Cow's milk is 20% whey, 80% casein. And the key proteins found in human milk also exist in cow's milk. And one of the findings, and when he started looking at this, because when he started working with whey protein, he was an expert in nutrition, but he didn't know a lot about it. And he said that one of the things that human milk confers on the baby is it's rich in cysteine because of the protein fractions. And so these are the things that he started working with and understanding how human milk is put together. What are the primary protein fractions? How to take it from the lab to an industrial process and preserve this property. And he said something very interesting. He said, the biological activity of this particular protein is not related to its nutritional efficacy. So you can have, 3 or 4 different proteins of equal nutritional efficacy, but a dramatic difference on biological effect. And that's what he found when he started comparing, for instance, soy protein with whey protein, with a mouse chow, etc.
So this is a unique distinction of this product over something that maybe comes in a pill form or a capsule form that might be on the shelves in my local health food store. Why is that a different decision than Immunical, John? because I also get that question too.
Yeah.
With, there's other ways I can take this. What's the downside of the other ways?
40 years ago, Dr. Bunos was the first in the world to publish on the association between glutathione and whey protein. And the mission of this company over the last 40 years has been to produce a product that consistently delivers the highest effect possible. And you can consider all the different research studies we've done over 40 years as independent quality control tests of the product. And I'll tell you a story. I was in the largest privately owned dairy in the United States, sitting with one of the owners, and he was telling me about a chain of stores, which I won't name, who said, the variability in whey protein across the spectrum is extremely high. And he said, this company will buy the cheapest whey protein we make, add in all these different things, and sell it as a premium whey protein. So, that's the opposite of what we do. We have a very particular methodology and formula with regard to Immunical, and it's continually measured, every year in different types of experiments, whether, it's on lung function, muscle function, brain function, etc. So there's a huge variability in the whey protein category, like any consumer product category.
Excellent. Tony, if you could go to our last slide here. John, I just want to make sure that before we open this up to Q&A, and if you do have a question, please raise your hand. I've had a number of other questions come in that are very interesting, but please raise your hand if you want to be acknowledged, and Tony will unmute you shortly. But you've mentioned Oracle for our audience. First time I heard that, I thought you were talking about Oracle years ago, which of course is a big technology company, but it is Oracle. And I wanted to make sure we talked a little bit more about their work. But before we do that, I also want to ask you the key findings in the clinical evidence. You've been heavily involved with this product for decades. There is a compilation of the clinical research now available in English and Spanish. And I've read that cover to cover, and I'm always amazed at the range of studies that we've seen for neurological disease, Parkinson's study, cancer studies. I mean, the range is so huge. But how would you narrow that body of evidence down for our audience today? What was the most striking thing that you learned going through this research for people as we get older? And why do you suspect I did so well in my recovery?
So one of the things that I had to learn when I started working with Dr. Bunos and started to understand what he was talking about is to not think in absolute terms, but think in relative terms with regard to our health. And, each of us carries a certain risk associated with our genetic profile, as well as the environment we create around ourselves. And, the life we've lived to date and the life we're going to live. And we're a product of our environment, and that the way we react to our environment is you can have negative adaptation or you can have positive adaptation. There's genetics in there as well, but what Dr. Droege explained to me, and he was, the world expert, the first to study glutathione in living organism. He says, after the 4th decade of life, you start to see this change in what's called the redox status of the body, this oxidation and reduction, which acts as a signaling system. And going from, a positive state vis-a-vis glutathione versus glutathione oxidized to the reverse. And there's a consequence to this loss of glutathione, this loss of cysteine in terms of the signaling system in the body, its effect on our immune function, its effect on a whole series of physiological properties. So in essence, it's a question of our risk profile goes up. When you're talking about cardiovascular diseases, when you're talking about neurological diseases. So it's all about managing risk. And Immunical is an incredible tool to manage risk because of the number of different functions it performs in the body, vis-a-vis detoxification, vis-a-vis immune function, vis-a-vis systemic inflammation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So while we can't say what our absolute risk is, vis-a-vis a catastrophic illness, what we're interested in doing and what athletes are interested in doing is managing the variables that give us the best chance to succeed. And so that's, how I would approach things.
Excellent. And the other thing I wanted to just touch on again is our resilience. You've mentioned that a number of times. I think that's so important for an aging athlete, right? Because of everything we've been talking about, because of the natural declines in a lot of things as we get older. And older, by the way, it's a little depressing. You're considered older if you're 55. You are considered a senior citizen at age 65. And yet the numbers defy that, because there are a lot of people who are in that age range still doing amazing things. I think of my brother, who is not a young man. He's at a weightlifting meet this weekend for, I guess, older athletes who can still bench press more weight than is imaginable. So the fact that this product is so important in our health, John, I want to ask you a question. Why don't doctors talk to us about it more? I've questioned a lot of MDs who get that puzzled look. I could tell they're thinking back to their basic courses, but this is not a mainstream discussion with your average health professional. Why is that?
I have a story to tell you. We did a study, the aging study we did in Montreal was in the French university system. And there's a scientist there, Dr. Remy Rabassa-Lauré. And Dr. Remy Rabassa-Lauré is one of the world experts in metabolic disease diabetes. And he's funded by the NIH, he's funded by the National Research Council of Canada. He said to me, John, when we were discussing the protocol, he said, John, companies come to me and they want to study something and it's so esoteric that it'll never apply to what's called Monsieur et Madame tout le monde, which Mr. and Mrs. everybody. He said what you're studying with regard to Immunical and its effect on muscle strength in the elderly population applies everywhere. So unfortunately, our world, like us, we're imperfect, and many times what's important in the world is determined by how much money you make on it. And so a lot of that is driven, through the influence of pharma on, universities, what gets funded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not all the best ideas get funded and not all the best ideas are known. And I think it's important that, we act as communicators and teach people to take control of their lives the same way athletes try and control their environment with the best information possible. So boosting someone's understanding of, how and the consequences of this interaction in our environment, in our modern day environment, and teaching them about glutathione, about Immunical, and using it as a tool to boost our capacity to make us more resilient to our environment is very important. And it's been, my work for the last 24 years to pass on that message.
Well, you truly are an ambassador, John, of health and information. And I know we could go on for many, many hours talking about some of the many aspects of research that you've been involved in. I don't see any hands up. Tony, maybe you're seeing them and I'm not. I do have a number of questions that came in through the chat. I've been trying to ask those as we go. Is there anyone who has a burning question and wants to speak to John directly? Oh, I see David Doctorow has a question. Tony, could you unmute David, please? Hi, David, welcome.
There we go.
There he is. Hi, David. Meet
Hi
John.
there. Hey, John, very interesting stuff. Obviously, as we age, a lot of our functions decline. And I was particularly interested, you referenced something called redox signaling. And I've talked to a bunch of people about that, how that declines with age. And that's the basic way our cells communicate. Is there any research you guys have done on immunocal that shows how that impacts or improves the body's redox signaling between cells?
Well, the probably one of the foremost authorities in the world, Dr. Wolf Droog, was he replaced Dr. Droog. He replaced Dr. Bunos when Dr. Bunos retired. So what I'm passing on to you is I'm quoting articles that Dr. Droog wrote on the subject, and essentially we've measured glutathione in a number of studies vis-a-vis immunocal supplementation. We actually now have proof that it modulates cerebral glutathione. We've also shown its effect on cysteine in the body. So by definition, we measure certain things in our clinical studies. So this redox signaling, by default, by boosting glutathione and cysteine, you're affecting redox signaling, because the important distinction is that even when these things drop as we age, the cell doesn't lose its ability to synthesize glutathione. So it's a question of the rate limiting factors are decreased, not the cell's ability to synthesize glutathione. So in our modern environment, many of us are probably walking around with functional deficits of this, which has consequences over time.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. And David, if you're interested in any of those references directly, you are all welcome to email me with any remaining questions that you walk away with today, and keep this conversation going. That was a great question. Thanks so much. And John, we have another one. People want to know about immunocal and what was found out in COVID-19. Can you talk for a few moments about that finding?
Well, we didn't study, because we're a small company, we have to pick and choose what we study. But what has come out with regard to COVID-19 is, these risk factors that people are associated with. And a lot of that is based on systemic inflammation. So there's a lot of literature now showing that many of these problems are associated with glutathione deficits, and that glutathione deficits in COVID-19 are a big problem. So you want to modulate glutathione and optimize it to the greatest degree possible. In addition, the way the immune system works is that glutathione deficits in the immune cell will change the way the immune system elicits the response to a virus. And there's lots of literature vis-a-vis AIDS showing that once the immune system becomes tired and worn out, that the immune system elicits the less effective response, which is called the Th2 response or humoral response, instead of the cell-mediated response or Th1 response. So glutathione affects that. So both in terms of the vitality of the immune system as well as systemic inflammation, it plays a big role.
Thank you, John. And if you all recall, John used an acronym without spelling it out, but he said glutathione immunocal is an antioxidant, works to build our immune system, and it's a detoxifier as well. So if you take away nothing else from today, remember that 10% increase in muscle building in older people in that study. I think that is so profound. And that 10%, I can tell you from working with elderly people, is a huge gain. It's the difference between continuing life and being in the corner like my grandmother was, and detoxing and our environment. And this isn't the last time we're going to be exposed to a virus. Let's all work on our immune systems, and being loving and kind and gentle and really tolerant of each other too, I think goes a long way. We're just about at time. I don't see any other hands up. As I said, we had quite a few questions coming in on the Q&A. I tried to ask them as we went, so a lot of those were your questions. If you didn't get to ask your question, please send it to me. My email should be available, or you have Tony's. And we can keep this conversation going. If you like this today, we can meet for a part 2 in the coming weeks or months. And again, I want to thank John Molson. I can't tell you all what a privilege it is to work with him and to be able to pick his brain for someone who was side by side with what I think was one of the most important discoveries, certainly of my lifetime. I want to thank you all. I want to wish you health and happiness. And thanks to everybody. Be well. We'll see you again. Thanks, John.
Thank you.